Everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving into a really interesting topic today, the U.S. trade deficit.
Yeah, the big one.
It is, and we're not just talking about the numbers. You sent us this article from Warren Buffett from way back in 2003, and
7-3, yeah.
it's fascinating. I mean, just packed with insight. So we thought, let's really unpack this, understand what he was getting at, what his concerns were, and how he proposed to fix things. All of that tailored just for you, of course.
Sounds good. I think a lot of folks listening probably already know a bit about the trade deficit, at least in general terms. But the cool thing about Buffett's piece is that he goes way beyond just defining it.
Right.
He's really trying to get at what it means for a country long-term, the implications for the economy, for the average person. And he even suggests a pretty unique way to deal with it.
Yeah, he does. And I think one of the first things that struck me when I was reading this was how cautious he is about, making grand pronouncements about the economy.
Oh, absolutely. He's actually really upfront about that.
Yeah. I mean, he admits straight out that he's been worried about inflation for way too long. Like, he kind of overdid it with the doom and gloom on that front.
Totally. And even more relevant to what we're talking about today, he brings up how he was sounding the alarm about the trade deficit way back in 1987. And, well, things didn't exactly implode right away.
No, they didn't. So it's interesting to see him acknowledging that, right? Like, hey, I was wrong before, maybe I'm wrong now, but...
But he's still pretty convinced that this is a serious issue. And this time it's not just talk. He points out that Berkshire Hathaway, his company, started making some big moves in 2002, investing in foreign currencies. And that's a pretty big deal for him. He basically steered clear of foreign currencies for over 7 decades.
Wow. So for him to suddenly shift gears like that really says something.
Definitely. And he's careful to say that the specific currencies they invested in aren't the main point. What matters is the underlying idea behind it, which is that holding those other currencies is kind of like betting against the U.S. dollar. It suggests a belief that the dollar is likely to weaken over time.
And that weakening, as he sees it, is directly tied to this ballooning trade deficit.
Exactly. His core concern is that the trade deficit has reached a point where it's siphoning off the nation's wealth at an unsustainable rate. We're sending more and more of our assets overseas. To really drive home this point, he uses a really interesting analogy.
Right, the islands. Squanderville and Thriftville. I love a good thought experiment.
Me too.
Yeah.
It's a great way to understand complex economic ideas. So picture this. 2 islands, completely identical, with very simple economies based entirely on food production. Everyone works 8 hours a day, just enough to feed themselves. Both islands are self-sufficient.
Okay, got it. 2 peaceful islands, living the simple life.
Right. But then the people of Thriftville decide they want to focus on saving and investing for the future. So they start working twice as hard, 16 hours a day. They still only eat what they produce in 8 hours, but they export the extra 8 hours worth of food to their neighbors in Squanderville.
And I imagine the Squandervillians are pretty thrilled with this arrangement.
Oh, absolutely. They get to enjoy life, relax, no need to work those extra hours, but they still have all the food they need thanks to the hardworking Thrifts.
And what do they give in return for all this food? Well, basically IOUs, written in their own currency, squander bucks. Buffett calls them squander bonds.
Squander bonds, love it.
So Thriftville starts piling up these squander bonds, which represent claims on Squanderville's future production. Now, Buffett says that even in Squanderville, some people start to feel like maybe this isn't such a sustainable situation. They realize that at some point, if they want to eat and also pay back those IOUs, they'll have to work more than 8 hours a day.
Right, the free lunch can't last forever. Exactly. But of course, no one really wants to face that reality. Meanwhile, over in Thriftville, they're starting to get a bit uneasy as well. They're looking at this massive pile of squander bonds and thinking, are these IOUs from a bunch of folks who seem to love leisure more than labor really going to hold their value?
Yeah, that would make me nervous too.
So they changed their strategy. They decide to sell a bunch of those squander bonds back to the Squandervillians in exchange for, you guessed it, more squander bucks. And then they use those squander bucks to buy up land in Squanderville.
Ah, so instead of holding paper promises, they're going for tangible assets.
Exactly. And over time, you can probably guess what happens. The Thrifts end up owning all of Squanderville. Now the Squandervillians are in a real bind. They have to go back to working 8 hours a day just to feed themselves because they've traded away all their land. Plus, now they have to work even more hours to pay off their debts and pay rent to the Thrifts for the land they used to own.
So Squanderville has basically been, as Buffett puts it, colonized by purchase rather than conquest. It's a pretty stark illustration of how a persistent trade deficit can lead to a transfer of ownership to foreign entities.
It is. And it's not just about the total value of assets, it's also about the flow of income. Now, you could argue that maybe this all balances out in the very long run,
Hmm.
right? Thriftville put in the extra work initially, and now Squanderville is paying them back. But Buffett points out the intergenerational inequities.
Right, the current generation gets to enjoy the benefits, but future generations are stuck with the bill.
Yeah, he even talks about it in personal terms. Like, imagine if he could consume everything he wanted in his lifetime on credit, and then his descendants would have to pay it all back. It might technically balance out eventually, but I doubt his great-great-grandchildren would be very happy about it.
Huh, no, probably not. And there's another wrinkle he throws in, right? The possibility that Squanderville, facing these mounting debt payments, might decide to just print a whole lot more squander bucks.
Exactly. Inflation.
Yeah, essentially devaluing their currency to make their debts easier to pay off.
And that's exactly why Buffett says that if he were a Thriftvillean, he'd much rather own land in Squanderville than hold a bunch of squander bonds. He believes governments are more likely to chip away at the value of their currency through inflation, he calls it theft by stealth, than they are to outright seize property owned by foreigners, theft by force.
So it's all about protecting your purchasing power. Now, how does all of this relate to the actual situation in the U.S.?
Well, Buffett argues that for a long time, after World War II and up until the early 1970s, the U.S. was basically acting like Thriftville. We were selling more to the world than we were buying, running trade surpluses. And as a result, our net international investment, the difference between what Americans owned abroad and what foreigners owned here, was steadily increasing. He gives some specific numbers, $37 billion in 1950 and $68 billion in 1970.
So we were building up our national wealth relative to the rest of the world.
Exactly. And it wasn't just the trade surplus. We were also receiving a lot of income from those overseas investments, interest, dividends, things like that. And that further boosted our ability to invest. It was like a virtuous cycle.
Save, invest, earn more, invest more. Classic wealth building.
Right. But then things started to shift in the late 1970s. We began running trade deficits, initially around 1% of our GDP, which is the total value of all goods and services produced in the U.S. each year.
Okay.
It wasn't seen as a huge problem at first, partly because that net investment income was still positive, and our overall net international investment position peaked in 1980 at $360 billion.
So it's still in a pretty good position.
Yeah, but since then it's been basically downhill, and that decline really accelerated in the 5 years leading up to 2003 when Buffett wrote this article. He points out that by then our annual trade deficit was over 4% of GDP, and the rest of the world owned $2.5 trillion more of U.S. assets than we owned in other countries.
Whoa, 2.5 trillion. That's a mind-boggling number.
It is, but to put it in context, Buffett compares it to the total value of publicly traded U.S. stocks, which was about $12 trillion at the time. U.S. residential real estate was also around $12 trillion, and he estimated our total national wealth at $50 trillion. So that $2.5 trillion, while massive, represented about 5% of our national wealth.
Okay, that helps. But still, losing 5% of your national wealth to foreign ownership doesn't sound great.
No, it doesn't. And the real kicker is that this foreign ownership was growing by about $500 billion every year. And this creates a negative feedback loop. As foreign ownership increases, more and more of the investment income from those assets flows out of the U.S. It's like negative compounding. Instead of earning interest on our savings, we're constantly paying interest on a growing debt.
So we're going from being a net receiver of income to a net payer. Ouch.
Yeah, it's the opposite of that wealth building cycle we were talking about earlier. And this is where Buffett brings in some basic economics. He says, look, large and growing trade deficits like this are generally unsustainable.
Right, I remember learning that in Econ 101. Something has to give eventually.
Exactly. Usually it's adjustments in currency exchange rates. When a country imports too much, its currency tends to weaken, making its exports cheaper and imports more expensive, which helps to rebalance things.
And sometimes creditors just get nervous and stop lending so much to countries that are living beyond their means.
Right. But Buffett acknowledges that the U.S. has a kind of special status. Because of our history of financial stability and the sheer size of our economy, other countries are still willing to lend to us. He even compares it to having a national credit card with a really high limit. But he's also quick to point out that even that credit card has a limit.
It's not unlimited.
Nope. And that's what brings us to his proposed solution, which he calls import certificates, or ICs. It might sound a bit complicated, but bear with me.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So the basic idea is this. The U.S. government would issue these ICs to U.S. companies that export goods, and the value of the ICs would be equal to the dollar value of the exports. So if a company sells, let's say, $1 million worth of products to another country, they'd receive $1 million worth of ICs.
Okay.
And then anyone who wants to import goods into the U.S., whether it's the foreign company sending the goods or a U.S. importer, would have to buy these ICs from the exporters. Essentially, to import $1 million worth of goods, you need $1 million worth of ICs that were generated by $1 million of exports. So it's a way to directly link imports to exports, creating a built-in balance.
So it forces trade to balance out. Interesting.
Yeah. Now, you can imagine that with the volume of trade we're talking about, this would create a massive market for these ICs. Buffett himself mentions that in 2003, our exports were around $80 billion per month. So you'd have billions of dollars worth of ICs being traded every month.
Wow, that's a lot of certificates flying around.
And to keep things from getting too speculative, he suggests giving them a limited lifespan, maybe 6 months.
Okay, so we've got this new currency, basically, the IC. How would the system actually encourage U.S. exports?
Okay, so let's say these ICs are trading at 10 cents for every dollar of exports. That means a U.S. company that exports $100 worth of goods not only gets that $100, but they also get an extra $10 by selling the ICs. That's essentially a 10% bonus.
Oh, I see.
And Buffett's thinking is that many exporters would view this as a reduction in their costs, allowing them to lower their prices in international markets and become more competitive. He even uses the example of aluminum. Let's say it's selling for 66 cents a pound in the U.S. With ICs worth 10%, a U.S. producer could sell it for, say, 60 cents a pound in foreign markets and still make a good profit.
Right, because that extra 6 cents is essentially covered by the ICs.
Exactly. And when American-made products become cheaper, naturally demand goes up, leading to more exports.
So one side of the equation is making exports more attractive. What about the other side, imports? How would they be affected?
Well, for foreign sellers, things get a bit tougher. Let's say you're importing a car that costs $20,000. To bring that car into the U.S., you'd now need to buy $20,000 worth of ICs. And if those ICs are trading at that hypothetical 10 cents on the dollar, your total cost just went up to $22,000.
That's a significant increase.
It is. And whether the importer can pass that full $2,000 increase on to the consumer depends on things like demand and competition. But in many cases, Buffett suggests that the foreign manufacturer might have to absorb some, or even all, of that extra cost.
Right, because if their prices get too high, people might just buy American-made cars instead. Now, one of the concerns you often hear when talking about anything that might limit imports is the idea of foreign countries dumping their dollars. Like, oh, if you make it harder for us to sell our stuff to you, we'll just get rid of all our U.S. dollars.
Yeah, that's a common worry. But Buffett isn't too concerned about it. He argues that because the trade deficit is constantly pumping more dollars into the hands of foreign entities, they basically have to reinvest those dollars in U.S. assets.
Because they're getting paid in dollars.
Exactly. They can choose what kind of assets they want. They could sell U.S. bonds and buy U.S. stocks or invest in real estate, but they can't just get rid of all their dollar holdings unless the U.S. starts running a trade surplus, which is, of course, the very problem we're trying to solve.
Got it. So they might shift their investments around, but the total amount of U.S. assets they hold has to stay roughly the same as long as the trade deficit persists.
Precisely. They can't collectively disinvest unless we start buying more from them than they buy from us.
Oh.
Okay, so we've established that the IC plan is designed to balance trade, make U.S. exports more attractive, and imports a little less attractive. But Buffett is very clear that this wouldn't come without consequences for us here in the U.S.
There's no free lunch, as they say.
Exactly. And the main consequence, he says, is likely to be higher prices for a lot of imported goods, and maybe even for some U.S.-made goods that compete with imports.
Right, because if importers have to pay more for those ICs, they're going to pass at least some of that cost on to consumers.
Exactly. So it essentially acts like a tax on consumption.
And that's never popular. People don't like paying more for things.
True. But Buffett argues that this potential short-term pain of slightly higher prices is better than the long-term pain of seeing our national wealth continue to flow out of the country.
He's saying it's like ripping off the Band-Aid.
Kind of, yeah. He believes the U.S. is in a unique position to sustain these big trade deficits for a while, but it's not sustainable forever. And the longer we wait, the more we risk ending up in a situation like Squanderville, where a large chunk of our assets are owned by foreigners.
Right, so better to address the problem now than to kick the can down the road and potentially face even bigger problems later on.
That's his thinking. And he believes that ICs would lead to a more balanced trade situation, with higher exports and lower imports, while still allowing for free market competition to determine which industries succeed. It's not about protecting specific industries, but about leveling the playing field in terms of the overall value of trade.
And he makes the point that this isn't something other countries would necessarily adopt, right?
Yeah, he says that countries that consistently export more than they import, what he calls net exporting nations, wouldn't have any incentive to use a system like this because their ICs would basically be worthless. It's a system designed for countries with large trade deficits, like the U.S.
Now, what about the risk of other countries retaliating? Could this lead to trade wars?
Buffett thinks that's unlikely. He points out that this is very different from something like the Smoot-Hawley tariffs of the 1930s, where the U.S. was trying to maintain a trade surplus at the expense of other countries.
Right. It was kind of a beggar thy neighbor policy.
Exactly. In this case, the U.S. would be trying to correct a trade deficit, something that most other countries recognize as a problem for the global economy. And he believes that major exporting nations would respond rationally. They might even try to increase their imports from the U.S. to reduce their need for ICs. He specifically mentions China, which had a large trade surplus with the U.S. back in 2003.
So instead of trying to punish the U.S., they might just buy more American goods.
Right. And if that happens, U.S. exports would increase, which could actually drive down the price of ICs, maybe even to the point where the system becomes less impactful or even unnecessary. And Buffett views that as a positive outcome.
It's like a self-correcting mechanism.
Yeah, exactly. He also acknowledges that there might need to be a transition period, maybe a few years, where the U.S. intentionally runs a small trade deficit to give the global economy time to adjust. And he suggests that the U.S. government could even auction off a limited number of bonus ICs or give them to less developed countries as a form of aid.
So it's a flexible system with room for adjustments.
It is. And while Buffett is always careful to acknowledge his past mistakes when it comes to predicting the future of the economy, his conviction about the urgency of addressing the trade deficit and the potential of this IC plan really comes through in his writing.
It's like, hey, I've been wrong before, but I really think this time it's different. So we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about Buffett's concerns about the trade deficit, his Squanderville and Thriftville analogy, his analysis of the U.S. economic history, and his proposed solution with import certificates. What are your final takeaways from all of this?
Well, for me, the biggest takeaway is that even though Buffett admits to being a bit of a boy who cried wolf in the past, his current conviction about the trade deficit is strong, and it's backed up by both his analysis and the actions of his company. He recognizes that his IC solution might seem unconventional, maybe even a bit gimmicky to some, but he truly believes it's the least disruptive and most effective way to address this massive outflow of national wealth.
And we can't forget the sheer scale of the problem he was describing. I mean, at the rate the trade deficit was growing in 2003, foreign investors could have been buying up almost 4% of all publicly traded U.S. stocks every year. That's a huge transfer of ownership over time.
It is, and it really makes you wonder, are we heading down the path of Squanderville? What are the long-term consequences of these persistent trade imbalances?
Those are great questions. It reminds me of that quote from Charlie Munger, Buffett's partner, who said, "All I want to know is where I'm going to die, so I'll never go there."
Ha, yeah, I love that one.
It really gets you thinking. If we want to avoid the fate of Squanderville, we need to understand where these trade imbalances might lead and what we can do to change course. So, to our listeners, we leave you with that thought. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. It's been a fascinating discussion.
It has. Thanks for having me.
Of course, anytime.
Cheers.